Works, of course. On this podcast, I hope to bring you up to date, keep you up to date with all the latest information about coping with COVID. We'll talk to the experts on issues like education, exams, and mental health, of course. But first, let's hear the most important voices of all in this issue, and that's Scotland's school pupils. Let's hear about some of the pressure that they've experienced.
Definitely been weird. I mean, like, because you've not got the support, I guess, of like your peers. You've not got your teachers like right next to you to help you. You have to email them and then wait for them to email you back, which could take hours. And by then you've probably finished like school.
Most of the times I get my work done, but sometimes I've got questions and my teacher can't answer them in time.
I think most of the time it was okay, but for some teachers, they're not on until like 11 at night.
I remember being sitting in my physics class when John Swinney's broadcast was put out from the Scottish Parliament explaining that exams would be cancelled, and so people jumped for joy and burst into tears because either the prelim grades were good or they'd failed their prelims. There was always the idea that your prelims are just your dry run, they're there to let you experience it. The grades don't necessarily matter, but suddenly they did matter. And it was just like being dropped into the ocean, because with schools not yet going back, there was very little support available in those really traumatic first few hours. For me, I had every single one of my grades downgraded, from just an A to a B, one from an A to an F.
You were in this constant like loneliness. You felt like that no one was there for you because you knew that they were struggling with like their own mental health. So you didn't really want to talk to anyone about it, to make them feel like, oh, what everyone else is going through, so you're nothing special about it. I definitely struggled, especially with maths. Like I would just be talking all the time because I'm trying to make up for like loss of contact. And then my teacher pulled me outside once and said, are you struggling in other classes as well? And then I almost started crying because I was like, yeah, I actually am, but I don't know how to say it. And then, of course, I tried to go to pastoral care, and my head of year, no one was there. They were all teaching classes because teachers were self-isolating.
Okay, that's the concerns and anxieties. Here's the message from the Scotland school pupils for those in charge of education about their own future, the future of their school.
Special needs schools have their own doctors and nurses, and I really hope in the future Main Street schools will have their own doctors and nurses, or just nurses.
The one message is listen, but also act as well. Don't make promises that you can't or won't deliver.
I would honestly say to them, well, if you're about to put all of us on lockdown, you should maybe like think how everything's going to work out, because there are some people who haven't got technology in their own houses, and it's difficult for them to learn.
Okay, powerful stuff. I'm sure you will agree, and very sincerely meant by those school people. We'll talk about all of that in a moment with my panel. First, I'll ask John Paul Holden, the Herald's education correspondent. JP, bring us up to speed with plans for the new term. First of all, when do the schools go back?
Well, schools go back in different local authority areas on different dates. Some will start to go back as early as next week, others the week after, and it's on different dates. So I would encourage people watching this maybe to consult their council's website for those dates. And with that, of course, the First Minister on Tuesday provided a major update on arrangements for the new term. It's a mixture of change and continuity. Key COVID mitigation measures will remain in place. For example, mask wearing by staff and by pupils aged 12 and over. And you will continue to have 1 metre physical distancing between staff and children. And that will be in place for 6 weeks and then subject to review. However, there will also be change going forward. Crucially, those identified as close contacts of individuals who have tested positive for COVID will not have to continue self-isolating as long as they get a negative PCR test result. So that will hopefully significantly reduce COVID-related school absence rates and make for a more stable relationship between pupils and school. And another major development, of course, on vaccines. The Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation has updated its advice. The Pfizer jab can now be offered to 16 and 17-year-olds, and they'll be able to register online for an appointment from tomorrow, except, I believe, in Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles, where they will be young people will be contacted by the local health board asked to attend clinics.
All right, JP, hold on to those thoughts for a moment. Let's bring in the panel. Thank you very, very much indeed for that. Joined today by Professor Stephen Turner. He's a consultant paediatrician from Royal Aberdeen Children's Hospital. He's speaking here for the College of Paediatrics. Thanks for joining us. Elaine Kerridge, Policy Manager at Children in Scotland. Deborah Gallagher, who's a guidance teacher at Kelvinside Academy. And Carol Monaghan, she's an SNP MP. More importantly, she's education spokesperson at Westminster. More importantly still, she's a former physics teacher and head of science. Thanks to all. We'll talk about the education aspect. Let's talk about the health aspect. Maybe go to Steve Turner first of all, and then the others can pile in. Are we ready, Steve? I mean, with this hideous plague has beset us for a year and a half or more. Are we ready? Are the schools ready to go back safely?
Well, I'll leave that for the educational people to say. Just that the headline figures from the health perspective is that the contrast between how this virus affects the youngest and the oldest members of our society could not be greater. So everybody is aware that in elderly people, this is a very life-threatening, very serious illness. But for reasons we still don't know, but for which we're delighted, this is an illness which, if children get, the vast majority of them either don't know they've got it or they have very, very minimal symptoms. So what we know from the last 16, 17 months is that individuals aged under 16 who get coronavirus very, very, very rarely run into any problems from the health perspective. But what we know is that the indirect impact of this infernal virus on our young children is profound. It affects their education, as we've heard. It affects their socializing, as we've heard. And it also affects their ability to access the health system that they might already be needing for conditions such as asthma, diabetes, and seizures.
Let's bring in that. Thanks for that. Let's bring in others. Elaine, we heard from the school students, the school pupils earlier. It was all about something missing, something falling short. They're trying to get support and it's just not there. They weren't particularly blaming people, but the message was constant throughout. They're just falling short in terms of the support and advice. God, they must be terrified. They must be really anxious.
Yeah, so we've worked with lots of children and people over the last year, and we've heard the impact it's had on all of them, wherever they live and whatever age they are. And obviously education's been a huge area for them, and the worry of how things have changed over the year. Being at home, home learning had its own challenges. Being in school has its own challenges. And all of that, of course, has impacted on their mental health and their relationships and who they can see and who they haven't been able to see over the last year.
Do you expect there to be, is it likely to be a lasting impact, or is it something, we always say kids are resilient, is it something they can get by, or has it been so severe that it could be a lasting issue?
Well, we have great faith in teachers. We know that they are so hardworking and it's been so challenging for them. And so we know that they will work so hard with the children and the young people when schools return. But absolutely, young people have felt isolated, and that's been rural and urban. Doesn't matter where you live, they felt isolated. And they've learned a lot online, but of course you couldn't have social contact online. They really missed that. So, we don't know the long-term effects, but we do suspect that there will be a lot of effects on those young people. But education hopefully will pick up very soon.
Well, you mentioned their praise for the teachers. Let's bring in a teacher and a former teacher indeed. First of all, Deborah Gallagher, you're a guidance teacher, I believe. We heard there that the pupils are saying that all the efforts are being made, but some of their teachers are doing police takes for other classes, filling in for others who are isolating it. Well, Deborah, that must place real pressure upon the school staff.
Absolutely. The pressure this year has been almost untenable at times, Brian. And what we've been dealing with is a body of people who are utterly committed to children, who volunteered during lockdowns to come in and staff lessons for key worker children and vulnerable pupils. And what we saw was pupils becoming vulnerable, not just to the mental health issues we flagged up earlier, but also digital vulnerability, which widens the attainment gap.
Explain that to me. I don't know what that means.
So that means that while learning was delivered on online platforms, that requires that pupils have the hardware, either with laptops, phones, or PCs at home, also that they have access to regular and stable Wi-Fi. And both of those things are clearly driven by the parents' ability to furnish them with these luxuries in some cases, and therefore that has a large impact on teaching and learning.
Carol, presumably, we've had a really challenging year gone by. Nobody anticipated this dreadful plague. Of course, nobody anticipated the extent to which it would impact upon us. Can it be better? Is it possible it can be better in the year ahead, Carol Monaghan?
I would really hope so. I mean, we're talking a lot just now about schools, but we've got to remember as well that for many young people, it was also all their social outlets that were closed off to them as well. Their clubs, their after-school activities, sporting activities that they would do. So this has been really tough for youngsters. They have been resilient. I've been so impressed by how youngsters have coped over this year. But I think it's not just about getting schools back to some sort of normality, but it's everything else that young people have in their lives. These social outlets in some ways, or for many youngsters, are more important than school, because it's a totally different kind of way of operating. It's not as regimented as school. So hopefully that we can see less disruption in the year ahead.
There are some complaints, Carol, that by continuing with mask wearing or face covering wearing for the first 6 weeks, continuing with some form of distancing in schools, that schools are facing tougher constraints than the rest of society. But do you think that's justified? Carol, and then Elaine, and then Deborah, perhaps.
I think it's something. I think whatever happens, there's going to be criticism. If the government were to say, you're not wearing face masks, some would be critical, including many teachers who might feel that they've been put in a vulnerable or a position of vulnerability. Most teachers have been vaccinated, but I think there are sort of real big questions there. So I think a cautious approach in face masks really is, if that can allow us to get back to normal or semi-normal situation in school, I think that's something that we should be doing at the moment.
Let's bring in Steve Turner before I come to the other members of the panel. Steve, of course, you described for us rightly and very helpfully the health hazards, the relatively low health hazard to children, but of course they could be passing it on to their teachers and other staff in school, couldn't they?
Yeah, and we know that has happened. But again, for reasons we've never really understood, the younger the child, the more they really have to try to spread the infection. So we know that the majority
treat it as a challenge.
Oh, listen, we've all been there. We've all been on the receiving end. But what we know is that the majority of infections within school have taken place between adults within the school premises, rather than between children themselves or the children and the adults.
So perhaps a staff room phenomenon rather than a classroom phenomenon.
I think that has been seen, and also in places like hospitals, that in staff copy rooms, for example.
Steve, just briefly before I bring in the others, are the health preventative measures that are continuing in schools, but not necessarily in the rest of society, or perhaps to a greater extent in schools? The face masks, the distancing. Is that justified in health terms, in medical terms? Would you say?
I think this is where health terms and societal terms get a bit blurred.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that you're going to reduce the transmission of any virus, any infection, by using social distancing and hand hygiene measures. So if the aim is to reduce the spread of this virus in the school estates, then the measures that have been in place historically seem reasonable to carry them on. But as we get further into this pandemic, there are some mixed messaging that we're giving. So you're all right to go out clubbing without your mask, but you have to wear a mask if you happen to be of an age where you go clubbing and go to school. It's going to get more complicated.
I'm still sure you're still a club regular, Steve. Where is it in Aberdeen these days? When I was in Aberdeen, it was the Crazy Daisy. That's probably long closed, but never mind. No, Elaine and then Deborah. Elaine, what about this? I mean, are these justified? These measures that are continuing in schools? There are some jibbing about them.
Yeah. So, excuse me. The children and young people we've heard from this year, understood that these measures had to be in place. They didn't enjoy being in bubbles. They found that difficult, especially if they were away from their friends. They didn't enjoy one-way systems because teachers didn't follow them, and other young people who were late to class were running. It just wasn't working.
Deborah. She means you. You're nodding there. Sorry, Elaine.
Actually, yeah, they said to us that they understand and they will be pleased to keep the hand washing, the hand sanitizer, the cleaning of the desks. The masks is a bit of a split because lots of young people struggle, especially those with additional support needs, to communicate with their teachers with the masks on. So whilst they understand in some spaces those might be necessary, for those pupils with additional support needs especially, that's been quite challenging for them.
Deborah, what's your take on this? Are these measures necessary, justified, whatever, proportionate?
I think to pick up on what Elaine was saying, like all things in education, masks, there must be an individualised approach, and it's based on your knowledge about the pupil, what they're capable of. And we've worked hard this year with individual pupils to communicate key messages to staff about how to support them with mask wearing and the other mitigations we've had in place. So I have spent this morning digesting the 68-page document released yesterday. Wow. So the good news is that the one-way systems, while they stay in place, that other things go, the bubbles go that you talked about, Elaine, and we know that's been very challenging.
Bubbles is what when kids stay together in one group. Is that right?
That's right.
Why don't they like those, Deborah? What's wrong with that?
Because pupils, like all other people in society, they self-select their peer groups. They feel more comfortable with some people than others. So to be put with people as an efficiency in schools to facilitate the delivery of a curricula, what we're doing is we are setting up bubbles that allow people to follow all their subjects, and that's how bubbles are created. It's based on those.
If there was self-selecting, you could see elites and cliques forming instantly. We can't have that. JP, you look keen to come in, perhaps whatever point you want to make, but also I'm keen to hear more about the vaccination. I mean, could it extend to 12 to 17, and then we'll ask Steve about the medical implications of that as well.
On the vaccinations, yes, it's possible that the Pfizer shot could be offered to 12 to 15-year-olds. I think the experts in the JCVI are waiting for additional data to come through on that. Okay. But the mood music certainly is that is a distinct possibility. And just on a question really about, I suppose, education recovery, and we hear a lot from the Scottish Government about what they're investing to provide additional staffing resource. And I just wonder what the panel members feel about that. Will that be sufficient? Will it ensure that education recovery really is driven forward? And maybe go ahead.
Sorry, JP. What you were saying it articulates with a point that Yohanne made, that everything seemed to be announced before thought was given to it. And when you mentioned the additional investment in education, I think more than just throwing money at the problem, which I know is a criticism that's been levelled at the government, what we need is strategy and guidance, because simply putting staff into unfamiliar environments and asking them to address a problem, we need to give due thought and consideration to the things that have to be addressed. So that was my concern. Yohanne talked about when he went to look for staff to help him, they were covering classes because there were teachers self-isolating. And I know the change in self-isolation protocols will address rates of absenteeism, but whether that leads to a better educational experience, and I mean the whole school experience, not just that in classrooms focused on learning and teaching, has yet to be seen, I think.
And I was quite struck by one of the pupils who talked about having nurses and doctors in school, and I suppose it's just a real plea there for there to be really significantly increased staffing and support and pupils.
JP, Deborah, hang on a second. I want to bring in a point for Steve Turner from I think it was Brian Hutchison had a question to us. What is good point again on vaccinations? Is what if we don't feel safe sending our kids to school? I would rather they were vaccinated first. Is it all? I understand why, because we were waiting for the JCVI. I'm not apportioning blame here, but Steve, is it all coming a little bit late with Scottish schools going back next week or the week after?
No. So if I can directly address Brian's, this is Brian Hutchinson's comment. I think schools are absolutely safe for children. There is no doubt in my mind, both as a doctor and as a parent of 4 children, that in these days, school and education is the best place for them to be.
Okay.
When we're talking about the pros and cons of vaccination and COVID in children, for the individual child themselves, and if we put just the child at the heart of it all, the risks of them coming to harm from COVID are eensy-weensy, tiny little dog polka dot bikini. They're tiny. And the risks from the vaccine are almost as tiny. So what we're trying to do as parents and medical decision makers is to compare two almost invisible sides of the argument. So, that's why there's been a lot of hesitancy about the vaccine, because for the child themselves, it really, the risk balance is actually almost neutral. But the discussion goes a little bit wider than just the child. It goes about, what about vulnerable parents in the house? What about granny? What about teachers in the school? But just to roll this back, Brian, you're absolutely safe sending your children to school. You reduce the chance of your children and yourself from getting COVID, not just from having a vaccine, but from all of the other stuff, the social distancing and all of the hygiene. But if I could just quickly talk about the vaccine, it's been a long time coming and we've not got to the end yet. I think that the current plan to vaccinate what are called the rising 18s, these are people aged between 16 and 17 and 3/4, seems very sensible, because socially and physiologically they're identical to their older siblings who are aged 18 and 19. So that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, Carol, what about the points we were hearing there about from the point from Deborah was making, that initiatives can be all very well in themselves, but perhaps they are implemented without thought as to how they're worked through. Is that just a factor of the fact that this is a dreadful and hideous virus that's inflicting us all?
I think one thing is that a lot of decisions have been taken with the very best of intentions and are been taken with the best evidence that's there at the time. And as we get to know more about the virus and we see how things are developing, hindsight comes into things and we get the whataboutery. And I think I think it's important to remember that this is something we're dealing. It's a novel virus. It's something we haven't experienced before, and we're still learning so much about it. So I think that's got to be considered. One thing I would say is, and I think Deborah makes a really good point about throwing money at things. Got to remember, in Scotland, teaching is still a profession, so it takes at least 4 years to train a teacher. In some cases, 5 years. It's not. We can't magic teachers out of the ether. So it's not as though we can just draft people in, shove them in front of classes, and expect them to know what to do. Which is why the difficulties that we've experienced over the last 18 months have been so acute.
Let's move to education. Elaine, let's come to you. Let's move to education more generally. Last year was dreadful. We heard from those school pupils about the pressures they were under. We know the problems of exams. Is that going to be better in the year ahead, Elaine? Is that will pupils be able to return to exams, or should they? Should we perhaps be considering different elements? I see Deborah smiling there. I'm going to come to her very shortly on that. Elaine, what's your take on that?
So that's what we've heard from young people, absolutely. Their feelings, I think, really changed over the year. They felt, as Marcus shared, it was very upsetting last year when it was last minute about what was going to happen, no exams. And then, of course, it changed over the year in the last academic year as well. And young people have told us they feel that they really weren't communicated with. They didn't feel that they were in the know what was happening. It was all felt very last minute. Things changed, and they would just have liked to have been included and consulted in those decisions. And that's what they want.
Isn't it? When you've got to make a decision. You're responding to a killer disease. You've got to make a decision reasonably swiftly. You've got to consult stakeholders. It's maybe not possible to consult every school pupil in school.
But there are groups, and the Education Recovery Youth Panel were involved in that as well, but not so much in the exams. So we know that SQE is being disbanded, and that's going to be looked at over the coming couple of years. And I know there's a commitment to engaging with children, young people in that. So we know that things will change, and young people have very clear opinions on what that could be. And some of them like exams, some of them don't. Some of them like that continuous assessment. But what they do want is for it to fit them, not for them to fit into that system. So whatever the new system looks like, it's got to be a child-friendly approach. It's got to be a child rights approach.
Okay, Deborah, you've written an article in which you say there's a golden opportunity to reshape the education system. Explain briefly, if you would, what you mean by that.
Yes, I think that many things have arisen from this crisis. It is novel, as Carol said, but perhaps it's a chance to step back and evaluate where we are. I think the assessment model we work within just now, with a dash to the final line and a one-size-fits-all exam system, is not fit for purpose. That was clear when the system could not be run by the SQA, and the onus for the delivery and assessment of courses was put, to my mind, very unfairly upon the teachers. It was done at the last minute as well. And I remember, I think it was Marcus who was talking about the announcement. I think it happened in the schools, everywhere. Absolutely, because teachers are watching to find out.
But would you get rid of, would you scrap hires, for example? Would you scrap them altogether?
Not necessarily, no. I think to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
What are you talking about then, if you're talking about a different form of assessment?
I think what we should look at is a more individualised approach. I think there was a good start made with a curriculum for excellence, and the SCQF allows for different levels of qualification at different times. But I would like to see a more vocational approach in Scotland, where some pupils for some professions or aspirations beyond school do take on exams, but there are other ways to qualify and show your level of attainment that are not simply exam-based.
Okay, let's try that with others. Carol, what do you make of that as obviously a serving politician, but a former very senior teacher? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I mean, I suppose it's quite popular to say we need to get rid of exams, continual assessment's a better idea, but we've got to remember that these actually test different things. I mean, exams are about response on the day and looking at sometimes knowledge recall, sometimes the ability to problem solve. Coursework is a different thing entirely. Coursework gives the opportunity to go away, consider a thing, to develop research, to bring together ideas, to discuss. It's a whole different thing. And the problem I have always had with coursework, and at the moment, by the way, COVID aside, the exams in Scotland are a mixture of both. There's a coursework element and there is the final exam, and that all
will that continue,
to the certification.
Will that continue, or will we revert to primarily being dependent on hires and advanced hire and all that stuff?
Well, even a hire or advanced hire will include a coursework element and an exam element, and I would see that continuing. My experience has been that coursework in its entirety, I know that's a very popular thing to talk about in terms of certification, but coursework in its entirety, in my experience, has favoured the more privileged, who have parental support, who have maybe better access to resources, stuff like that. So we have to be quite careful.
Have to be blunt, parents and grandparents and uncles and etc. who might write the blasted thing.
Well, if one of mine were to come home with an essay about politics, would I cast my eye over it before it went back to school? I might do that. So we've got
that
to
bit
consider,
about how the SNP are rotten. No, we're not putting that in.
Well, you've got to consider the support and what goes on behind the scenes. So I think exams were actually developed to level the playing field, and it's important that we don't lose that aspect.
Let's go back to Deborah on that one. Deborah, what do you make of that?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of value in what Carol's saying. It absolutely is. But exams in and of themselves are not a suitable assessment method for every child. We have one style of exam, we have one approach, and no matter what you do to mitigate things, what factors are put in place to support pupils with additional support needs or other conditions that must be considered, it doesn't necessarily mean that that sets up an environment where that pupil can evidence and showcase their learning. I think we have to look to other models of education. We could look at Vivas, we could look at practical coursework elements, which would take the pressure off. I take your point completely, Carol. Tutor-led approaches and the privilege involved in being able to support coursework intensively at home.
Let's bring in Steve and then JP. Steve, from you, not obviously not a medical perspective, but a perspective as an adult member of society in Scotland. What about the university perspective? Would they still want to see, I don't know, 5 hires rather than coursework?
Yeah, so until very recently, I worked for a university, and I've got 2 children at university. One just about to go, and one who's just done the National 5. So I've had chapter and verse from lots of people about how this infernal pandemic has impacted education in the sort of 16 to 26-year-old age. So my sense is a more basic question: what's the point of school and further education? And I have come to the conclusion that, in a nutshell, it's about preparing young people for life.
Okay.
It's about preparing people to work hard, to take turns, to find out that sometimes you work hard and you don't get what you get. And every now and then you don't work that hard, but things seem to go well. So I think that in terms of the best way to assess an individual, the more facets, the more windows you have on that person, the best. How would you measure the best reporter in Scotland, for example? It would be unfair just to interview you all. So you would take a number of different perspectives. So having gone through a system where I was examined totally and solely on exams, I'm not sure that's the right way of doing it. So I think a hybrid system is very much the way forward. That would be the modern way of doing it.
I did a degree in English, but I then did a course in journalism as when I was employed by a newspaper, and my tutor there said the thing you needed for journalism was rat-like cunning. I'm not quite sure how you would measure. I think I've probably got an A star in rat-like cunning, but not that the A star exists in Scotland, of course. Although I gather parents readily demand it from their kids. JP, what's your thinking on this? An opportunity to reshape the education system, or are ministers going to be sort of concerned and not to shake the boat about too much? We're not hearing you, JP. If you can unmute yourself, please.
Apologies. Yes, sorry.
On you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an opportunity to redirect the assessment system in Scotland, and there's a growing clamour for that. Moving away from the COVID topic for a second, the discussion, reminded me, of course, that the OECD published a major report on curriculum for excellence recently, and that was really highly critical of the assessment culture in Scotland, particularly within the senior phase. And it spoke about pupils complaining that there was too much memorisation, too much rote learning, not enough creativity. Yes, there is a continuous assessment element within the system currently, but it's clearly not enough, and so that the senior phase is not sufficiently aligned with the ideals of the curriculum for excellence in terms of developing those individual capacities that I think sort of Steve was maybe touching on there. So and given the apparent decisiveness with which Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville accepted the recommendations of the OECD report, and remembering of course that there is a working report on assessment due to come later this year, I think we could be looking at towards more kind of portfolio-based, teacher-based, continuous assessment-based approach. But I do agree that the exam system does have merits. It does level the playing field, and there is value in I guess putting a pupil on the spot, what they can deliver.
Thanks, JP. Come to Elaine briefly on this. I'm going to move on to health-related issues in a second. But Elaine, to be satirical and cynical about this for a second, you do have to have some memory-related education. You don't learn quantum mechanics and German grammar through the medium of dance. You've got to sit down and learn the damn things, don't you, Elaine?
Well, yes, I just feel it's the wrong way round, that you're asking what are the universities looking for from our young people. But let's tell universities what they should be looking for from our young people. It's the wrong way round.
They'll tell you 5 A's.
Exactly. And we jest about dancing, but when children and young people enjoy what they're doing, they learn, they grow as people, and that's who you want to go to university. That's who you want in your workplace, is a rounded, successful person, and success comes in lots of different ways. So I do feel the exam system, it does feel outdated for our young people, and I just feel it's the wrong way around.
Let's move from that. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to devote that entirely to the issue of mental health issues arising from the pandemic, arising from the stresses and strains. We heard of those stresses and strains in very, very vivid terms from the pupils at the start of this podcast. Carol, you go first. It really has been a big issue, hasn't it?
Oh, it's a serious issue, and it's been a serious issue even before the pandemic. And I think one of the things, if we consider positives to come from the pandemic, there are very few, but one of them is that there is a renewed focus on mental health, and we are taking it far more seriously. We're listening to young people, and we're actually, putting in place different things that the young people can access. We've got a long way to go, and I think I don't know that there's any young person that hasn't been impacted in some way. For some of them, it's been devastating. For others, it might be less. But I think every young person has been affected by this. It would be tough not to be.
Deborah, you must encounter these sort of pressures and stresses in your pupils and students on a daily basis.
Absolutely. I mean, we have seen massive numbers of pupils suffering in one way or other. And you talked about, Brian, it being a generational issue. I worry not so much about what we've dealt with, but what lies ahead. Because what we know about trauma is that it's something that is unearthed after the event. So if in fact we're moving beyond the COVID landscape into a different kind of world, this is when I expect to see pupils unravel. We have had young people and adults as well living for the past 18 months in a state of some panic, expecting the unexpected all the time. And we know that we are not built as humans to deal with that level of stress, that it affects us. It develops hypervigilance and generalized anxiety and all kinds of other things.
So individuals' confidence may have been just undermined, and that could be a lasting problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. We talked a lot about education, but what we know with certainty is that you cannot educate someone who is mentally unable to understand
because of trauma.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Elaine, I saw you nodding very, very vigorously in agreement with that.
Yeah. So the young people we're speaking to are very clear about having felt isolated this year, being anxious, very anxious about exams and things. But absolutely agree with Deborah that we don't know that long-term effect physically and mentally in young people. And we know that will come out as the years go on. So we need to be supporting them now. They need support from all different aspects in their lives to make sure that we reduce those negative outcomes.
Okay, Steve, what's your take on this?
Well, just to back up what's been said. So before the pandemic, we knew that about 15% of young people in Scotland across the UK had a mental health disorder, and this was predominantly anxiety and depression. Okay. So it's not a surprise that a global pandemic has fueled those pre-existing levels of anxiety and depression. The problem that we face as a society, and this is seen in school and in hospital and at the table at tea time at home, is that we don't have a system in our society for supporting children and young people and also their parents who are having problems with anxiety and depression. Historically, our grandparents have just told us to buck up and just knuckle on down. And so we have this situation where we have teachers who are educated, we have doctors who are educated, but neither of them are trained to help young people understand their anxiety and depression and manage it. So we've got lots of people who can recognize the problem. We've got lots of people with the problem, but what we do not yet have is a means of releasing that problem. And it would seem that unless something is done fairly soon, that problem is not going to get smaller. And as we've been saying, might well get bigger.
If we were at 15% before, is it possible to estimate what level we are at now or could be in the year ahead?
Well, inevitably, research has stopped. No. There was a little bit of research that I did see that was done, because you can actually do a little bit of this work remotely. And essentially, if you were a child during pandemic days whose parent had anxieties,
yes,
your chance of being anxious was even higher than if your parent didn't. So what little information we have so far is that there's a bit of an interaction within the households, and we've all been locked in together. But if you've got parents who are struggling to cope, who don't have the resilience that many of us do have, their children don't have it, and that fuels it. So it's
might it go away? Might it go away when the virus goes away, or is it likely to be a trauma? As you're all shaking your head at that one, it's in. Let's talk
Brian,
about
Brian,
please, Carol. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to add in very quickly. I think we also, as parents or as politicians or as medics or whatever our role is, I think we also have to be quite aware of additional anxieties that we can bring about by using phrases like, children are falling behind on coursework, or we need them to catch up. Catch up with what? Catch up with metrics that we have set. So we need to be careful about the language we use and the drive that we have for these young people.
So if you're setting targets that are unrealistic, unfair, and unattainable, and you're
absolutely.
You're dooming these children to okay.
Let's cut them some slack.
What have we got left? We've got a few minutes left. Let's talk about where you want to see things going in the year ahead. Let's confine it to that year or beyond, whatever you fancy. Deborah Gallagher, where are we heading? What do we need to do collectively as a society in Scotland to improve matters for our schools and for our school students?
I want us to continue to build on a platform of positive mental health and put pupils' needs first. I completely endorse what Carol said. This was not a lost year. It was a different year experienced globally, and we have to look at it through a different vector than the one we talked about. Different things were learned, and the metrics for success are important as well. The stress caused for pupils who were looking for certification was considerable, but I talk about school rather than education purely because school is so much more. And that's what we learned last year. It's about the social patterns. I don't think teachers should be people who impart knowledge to fill an empty vessel. No. Instead, I see as much more as being Sherpas, introducing young people to different experiences and subjects, to themselves, to others, and helping them just move along that journey. I think we have to have a much more holistic view of education and young people.
Do we need, maybe we should have put this to you earlier, Steve's idea of we need to cope with the mental health problems in schools and associated with education in a different way? Do we need a new area of expertise or what? Or do we deploy the existing teachers in a different fashion? What do you reckon? Just briefly on that, if you would.
The teachers that we have are excellent, world leading.
No, I'm not saying that.
I know you're not being critical, so let's upskill them. We have such an excellent resource here who have the volition to serve the young people of Scotland. I would like to see an increased focus on something that has a pretty bad reputation just now, personal social education, and have it dealing with the real things that would upskill people for the challenges that life throws at them, anticipated and otherwise.
Thank you. Let's move around the panel. We don't have a lot of time. But JP, the year ahead, what do you think is likely to happen? What do we need to happen?
I would just echo what's been said in mental health. It just reminds me of a conversation I had with a GP whose colleagues observed a real increase in young people coming to her with complaints about mental health, including suicidal ideation in the run up to exams. So I just think there needs to be a real radically changed approach to mental health, and I would really in the schools, and I would really hope to see a lot of work in that area going forward.
Steve Turner.
I'll keep it short and brief. Let's get it right for every child.
Oh wow, that's the style. Well, your lectures must have been a joy to attend, Steve, when you were at the university. Elaine Kerridge, and then finally Karen. Elaine, what are we looking for in the year ahead? What do you think maybe school pupils are looking for in the year ahead?
So how we get it right for every child is to listen to every child. Okay. And they want to be in school, they want that relationship with the staff, they like being supported by staff, but they want to have their voices heard in all these things that are going to change over the coming years, but what mental health supports they need, how exams will change, so they need to have their voices heard and respected.
What it done with them rather than to them. That I was really struck by those comments. Really stuck. Steve, got a big thumbs up from Steve for that one. Carol Monaghan, I'll give you the last word. What do we expect or need or hope to hear and hope to see happening in the year ahead?
Well, I think one of the great things that has happened is the development of online resources and the quality of resources that are now available. So I think there'll be far more use of these for children that can't attend school for whatever reason, COVID or otherwise. But I think we also need to see an increased importance and focus on out of school experiences, be that sporting or other. These are so important for youngsters out with the formality of school, and I'd like to see far more youngsters participating in such clubs and activities.
It's true enough. It's what you remember from school, isn't it? Rather than, dare I say it, higher physics. It's what you remember is the.
You had the wrong
the
teacher for higher physics, Brian. That was the
I had a
problem.
wonderful teacher, for higher physics. I was very keen on physics, but it was great stuff. But look, you've all been terrific. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining me today. Thanks for all your ideas. Thanks for listening to those remarkable comments from the school pupils at the beginning, and thanks to the audience for listening to this podcast from the Herald. From me, Brian Taylor. Toodaloo.